Hey, welcome back to Modern World History, and today we're going to finish up our unit on absolutism by looking at kind of the opposite effect. Whereas kings were becoming absolute monarchs in literally every European country that we've talked about up to this point, we're going to look at how Parliament clashes with English monarchs and how they tend to kind of go in the opposite direction towards a more constitutional monarchy. So, here we go. It all starts with Elizabeth I, who succeeded her father Henry VIII, or actually I guess her sister Mary, and Elizabeth, the whole time that she is monarch, there are going to be money problems. So she has a hard time with finances, and the problem here is that Parliament is the one who has power over the crown's financial situation, and so she has to ask Parliament for money whenever she needs it. And so she has tons of money problems, and eventually she's going to die in 1603, and she doesn't have any money. The country is in debt, and so she leaves that debt for her successor, James Stuart, to deal with. Now, James is already the king of Scotland. Here's the deal. Elizabeth didn't leave an actual heir. She had no children, and so they were like, okay, well, James Stuart is already the king of Scotland, let's let him be the king of England as well. Now, this is a pretty weird situation because you gotta remember, Scotland, and England are not united. So, essentially, they have one king that governs both of them, but they consider themselves completely different places. So, it would almost be like if you were a teacher and you teach two different classrooms that are completely different classrooms. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but nevertheless, in England, James Stuart still had more money problems because, he was left in a pretty terrible situation, and Parliament didn't give him money when he needed it. He also somewhat offended the Puritan members of Parliament by not taking out some of the Anglican practices, and he hoped, or they hoped, that he would enact reforms that would do away with those somewhat Catholic-looking practices that Elizabeth kind of left in her moderate form of Anglican religion, Anglican Christianity. So, aside though from a new translation of the Bible, he didn't really do that, and so they were reluctant to give him money, and his son Charles I comes to power and has even more money problems. So, this is a continuing theme from monarch to monarch. Now, Charles's money problems might be a little bit more extreme. He was fighting several wars with other countries, like Spain and France, for example. And he would oftentimes ask Parliament for money in order to wage those wars. One of those times that he asked Parliament for money was in 1628. And this time, Parliament required him to sign a document called the Petition of Right. Now, if you look at this really isn't something that an absolute monarch would be chomping at the bits to sign. So it limited his power pretty big time. He agreed in this Petition of Right, for the sake of getting money, that he would not imprison subjects without due cause. Apparently, kings would traditionally imprison people for no reason and then leave them in prison for forever and a day. He also could not levy taxes without Parliament's consent, again, Parliament controlling the money. He was not allowed to house soldiers in private homes. That was kind of a big deal. And that's also a big deal in our Constitution. It says we can't do that. And he is not able to impose martial law during peacetime. In other words, he can't go down like military protection if we're not at war. And so these are things that he thought would limit his power, but he needed money, so he went ahead and signed the document and then decided he just didn't care, he wasn't going to do any of that stuff. In addition to all these things, this established that law is more important than the king. The law is bigger than the king. And the king can't just call the shots by speaking laws out of his mouth like Louis XIV could. Now, James is going to ignore this, but it kind of sets the stage for laying the groundwork that we're going to see here in Britain later on. He viewed this as a document that contradicted absolutism. Now, people hated Charles because of his high taxes. Now, he had to tax the mess out of everyone because he couldn't get money from Parliament. So in order to get the money he needed, he decided he was going to impose high taxes instead. So in addition to this, he also tried to impose like Anglican Christianity or some kind of Anglican rituals on Scotland. He thought that both of his kingdoms should have the same basic religion, and this outraged the Scottish, and they rebelled against him. So Charles needed money. He needed money to fight the rebellion, and Parliament saw this as an opportunity to get even more power over him. He needed help. They were going to use this as an opportunity to change some things. So they passed laws that were designed to reduce Charles's power, and Charles in turn tried to arrest some of the Parliament members that did this. So I didn't write this in. Arrest Parliament members. And this, in turn, that he didn't succeed, they got away. All right, so they got away. And this caused the Londoners to revolt. And so Charles fled to the north, where he had people that were still loyal to him, and he raised an army where he was going to come in and fight and teach these Puritans a lesson. Now, the Puritans were called Roundheads, and the Royalists, or people loyal to Charles, so Royalists, were known as Cavaliers. So at first it looked like the Cavaliers had the edge. They were winning battles, and it looked like Charles was going to win this war. And then enter Oliver Cromwell. So Oliver Cromwell was a general that was able to take the Roundheads, the Puritans, and turn the tide of the battle. And eventually he was able to capture Charles and take him as prisoner. And then they tried him and sentenced him to death, which is completely unheard of. Now, there are plenty of times where the kings might have been killed in battle, or they might have been secretly killed, but he publicly killed, publicly executed their sitting monarch. And so who kills their sitting king? This is crazy stuff. So once in power, once Charles is completely gone, he's dead, Cromwell ends up dissolving the monarchy, and he got rid of the House of Lords and established a republic, which he called a commonwealth. So he also had an individual named John Lambert who wrote a constitution for Cromwell, but after a little while, Cromwell realized that this wasn't working for him. He ripped it up and established a military dictatorship, and basically didn't make the Republican Commonwealth that he had planned on doing it to begin with. And he was also, it's important to know that he was a Puritan. Okay, so he's a Puritan, and he wants to make the changes that the Puritans were fighting for in Parliament. And so the Irish saw this as an opportunity to rebel. They had been put under firm control by Henry VIII, and they had continually been under the control of the English during all this time. And they rebelled now that Cromwell is in power. Cromwell ends up going and putting down very harshly that rebellion that led to hundreds of thousands of people dying of things like fighting and disease and famine and all these things. Now, over here on the side, I wanted to mention that Ireland is not part of England. Today, it's not even part of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is going to include, I'll go ahead and do that, these kingdoms here: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. But Ireland is still today an independent country, and they're also primarily Catholics. So they were not controlled, or they were controlled by England, but they're not English. Alright, so Cromwell wanted to establish a Puritan society. In doing so, he did tolerate all Christians except Catholics, and he did away with any kind of sinful activities such as dance and theater. And then, like all good things, Cromwell ends up dying, and at this point, the government was just kind of crumpled, and no one really came to restore that and pick up where he left off. and the people had already grown very tired of militaristic rule. And so this brings about the Restoration period, where literally the monarchy was restored. So monarchy is restored, which is why we use the word restoration here. Charles II was the new monarch. He was the oldest son of Charles I, and in Parliament voted to ask him to be the new King of England. And he restored the monarchy. Now, Parliament didn't just do this lightly, but they actually used this opportunity again to further limit the power of the kings by enacting a law known as Habeas Corpus, which is kind of a big deal. It says the king can't imprison people simply because they oppose him. So you can't be imprisoned for no reason. A judge is going to determine whether you should be let go or whether you should be kept in prison. And additionally, you can't be held indefinitely. So people, if you can't have a trial, they have to let you go. So it gives people more rights and takes away the power of the king to just do as he pleases. That's a big deal. And so Charles II ends up dying, but didn't have an heir. You know, that seems to be a trend here during this time period. And James II becomes the new king. Now, here's the thing, is that James was the brother of Charles II, but James was also a Catholic. And so, you know, different people would start taking sides. They're like, well, on the one hand, we want this legitimate heir to Charles II. But on the other hand, we don't want no Catholic coming into power in England. And you start to see this division between the Whigs and the Tories. And this here actually sets the stage for the earliest political parties in English politics. The Whigs opposed James because he was Catholic, and the Tories supported James. Now, lo and behold, James does become the king, and what do you know, he enacted Catholic reforms, the same ones that everyone was kind of freaking out about, that, hey, we can't have a Catholic king. And so he started doing things like appointing Catholics in high-ranking positions and things like this that were supposed to be illegal by English law. And so Parliament, you know, they no longer want him, and they want another Protestant line of kings. And so they go and they invite William of Orange to overthrow the monarchy. Now, William of Orange was married to Mary, the daughter of James II. So there would be that level of validity there, and you know, to the English line. They invited him to overthrow James, and so he gets his army, and they march on London, to which James just runs away. He fled. He went to France, and it was a bloodless overthrow that's now known as the Glorious Revolution. So under William and Mary, England adopts a constitutional monarchy. All right, so when William and Mary come in, they're seemingly okay with sharing their power with Parliament. So here's the way it's going to go down. There was going to be a Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights essentially does these things here. You can't suspend Parliament's laws because you're a king. If Parliament passes a law, it's law. There's no taxation or no taxes without a grant from Parliament, so Parliament's going to decide when the king can levy taxes. That gets rid of the issues that we had with Charles I. You also can't interfere with freedom of speech in Parliament, so you can't have a Parliament member arrested for saying something that might be contrary to the way the king thinks. And you can't penalize a citizen who petitions the king about grievances. So these are all different rules and laws that detract from the absolute power of monarchs. And so we can definitely see that the English has stepped away from absolutism in this case. After 1688, king and parliament could not rule without the consent of one another. And they also established the cabinet system. And leaders of majority party are going to head up the cabinet. The leader of the majority party is going to be known as the prime minister. And so we still see where that system is in play today. And also you can look and see where many other countries in the world today use a system similar to this. Many of those were part of the British Empire that we're going to talk about when we get into imperialism. So there you have it. That's the Glorious Revolution. That's England's step away from absolutism. And that ends the Unit 4 of our World History course. See you in the next unit.